Okay. Good morning, everyone. My name is Karen Littlewood, and I'm proud to be here today representing over 60,000 teachers and education workers as president of the Ontario Secondary School Teachers Federation. This past Monday, the government released the Grants for Student Needs. They established the base funding for education. They show how much funding school boards will receive for the next school year. I am sure many concerned parents, caregivers, students, and community members missed the release of these funding numbers on Monday, and I would say that was no accident. We have no doubt that the government deliberately made education announcements on Sunday and Monday to distract from the Grants for Student Needs. And why? Why would they do that? Because the Ford government is not investing in public education. Not a headline that the government wants out there, I'm sure. The government is claiming that they have increased funding by 2.7%, but this is false. They've artificially reduced the subtotal of the funding for the past school year in order to make the amount for the 2023-2024 school year seem artificially high by comparison. And how did they do that? Well, for example, more than $300 million that was given last year for COVID-19 Learning Recovery Fund was removed from last year's subtotal. So when the real numbers are compared, the increase for this year is 1.4%. But again, the number is misleading for two reasons. Firstly, the enrollment has increased 0.6%, meaning the increase is a mere 0.8%. And secondly, I don't think I have to tell anyone that 0.8% is far from below the current rate of inflation. We've all been impacted by rising costs, and this matters for education funding as well. Any school board can tell you that. The Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives has done some critical analysis of this year's Grants for Student Needs. They found that when the numbers are adjusted for inflation, the Ford government has cut per student funding by over $1,200 since the 2018-2019 school year. And this year saw the biggest cut. Over $600, half of that entire $1,200 cut is from this coming year's Grants for Student Needs. The Ontario Progressive Conservative Party is deliberately shortchanging students and underfunding public education. The government loves to claim that they're making historic investments. They like to say they put students first. The minister even stated his mandate is to demand better for Ontario children. Well, I know that teachers and education workers want better for students too, and I wish they would make historic investments. Ontario needs them, except they need real investments and not just empty talking points from the minister. We certainly need real investments when it comes to mental health, yet funding for mental health has barely changed for the next school year. And this is despite the groundbreaking reports that came out earlier this year showing clearly, without a doubt, that students have increased mental health needs following the pandemic. The Ford government is also not increasing funds to help with post-pandemic learning recovery. Again, more misleading announcements that are clearly missing from the funding numbers. On Monday, the government talked a lot about improving student outcomes when they tabled Bill 98. I was here at Queen's Park when the Minister of Education claimed that Bill 98 is a result of talking to parents. The minister claimed to know what parents want and stated confidently that parents' voices are driving the ministry's policies. I've been an educator for over 30 years, and I have never heard a parent or caregiver ask for billions in cuts to education, for $1,200 less for their child. I've also never heard them ask for a ballooning school backlog repair backlog. They've never asked for larger class sizes or underfunding of mental health supports or to ignore the issues of violence in the classroom. But here we are. This is what the Ford government is giving us. And when I read through Bill 98, an education bill no less, do you know what words are missing? Public education. Not one time did the Ontario PCs include the phrase public education. The word public was barely in there at all. And that is our fear, that this legislation is about making education less public and more private, increasing for-profit interests in our public education system. They've said the quiet part out loud, and they hoped no one was listening. We've watched this government go back on their word and open up the Greenbelt to developer friends. We've watched them increase private surgeries and other medical care. And just this week, we watched them announce moving the Ontario Science Centre out of its beloved community and again, more likely to hand that land over to developers. And now they're zeroing in on school buildings. School boards are crying out for funding to fix the more than $16.8 billion school repair backlog. That's one of their biggest issues, not that there are too many underused schools. Their justification for selling off schools is just a cover for transferring even more public land to private developers. I'm clearly out of touch with the Ford government because I don't view schools as real estate assets. I view them as community hubs that we need in order to protect and enhance for the benefit of everyone. But this government doesn't care about communities or local needs. They want more provincial oversight, more bureaucracy, more red tape, and less autonomy for local democracy. Local school boards will now have a decreased ability to meet their students' unique needs, less able to directly serve their community. The PCs also said they want greater transparency and accountability. This was clear throughout their Bill 98 announcement. Side note, this is quite rich coming from the same government that's been at the Supreme Court this week, fighting to keep their mandate letters secret from the public. It's also rich coming from a Ministry of Education that did not consult with a single education union on this bill. They're acting as though it's already a huge success. How can it be a success when educators and even they, the Ford government, do not yet know how it will be implemented? They didn't consult with us or other key stakeholders on how to make their bill a reality, how it would even work in the real world or in the classroom. Delivering education is not like pressing a button and having a lesson plan pop out. Teachers, education workers, school boards, and communities themselves need to be part of the consultation process. And this cannot happen properly or effectively in the short time from now until September, when many of these changes, that new language curriculum, are expected to be rolled out. The delivery part of the education cannot be an afterthought. We are at the table right now, bargaining with the Ford government. It's one example of a place and a space where we could engage with them in discussions on how these changes can be effectively implemented, how we can ensure student needs are met, because that's what should be driving this kind of legislation, meeting the needs of students. Yet we continue to be undermined by an untrustworthy government that's been driven by a pro-private, anti-public agenda. And I say enough is enough. Ontario students cannot be used as fodder in the PC's ideological agenda. So I'm here today to call on the Ford government to stop shortchanging public education at all levels and to meet with us to consult on critical education legislation. We need to work together, not against each other, to ensure we can deliver the best possible public education for Ontario students. And I call on everyone out there who is listening, please reach out to your MPP, ask them about Bill 98, tell them that you are against this move and that you're against the continued short-changing of public education in Ontario. Ask them to give us grants for student needs that will meet the needs of the students of the province. Thank you for listening, and I will now take questions.
Can you go back to your first point about how the government's making this year's GSNs artificially high? Can you explain what you mean by that?
Yeah, so there was monies last year that were for COVID supports. They've taken those monies out, so comparing last year minus the COVID supports to this year, it looks like it's an increase, but it's not an increase.
Not fair for them not to include the COVID-19 funding. It was supposed to be one time or during the pandemic funding.
Yeah, I think it's more about the numbers and the way that they're presented and the reality in the schools right now, and that the supports are not there. So the monies are not there, and what we're not seeing is the investment in education. So we can talk about the numbers last year and this year, but the reality is right now in the schools, the supports are not there for the students.
It sounds like this is setting the stage for a bit of a flashpoint with the government when it comes to the negotiations. How are those talks going? Are they actually progressing?
We've been very patient. We've waited. We knew that people were tired, that the government was talking about stability. We've been talking about stability and the stability that our members bring. We were hopeful the budget might show more than a factory on the front and maybe would mention education. It did not. The grants for student needs are insufficient and don't indicate the investment that's needed going forward. Of course, that spills over into what's happening at the bargaining table, but what we're talking about is what the students need right now and the investments that are needed for them to be successful.
But that seems to indicate that you're not necessarily getting the requests that you're putting forward at the bargaining table. Certainly, maybe not as high as what CUPE would have gotten in their final negotiations. But is there movement there? Are you guys any closer?
So I'm not here today to talk about bargaining, and if I was, it would be a really short press conference. There's not much to say because nothing is happening. We had 2 days in April, we had 2 days in March. We don't yet have our days set for May. The government wants to come and say we're investing in education. They could have indicated that in the budget. They could have indicated that in the grants for student needs, and they can indicate it at the bargaining table. The fact that I'm not here to talk about bargaining should also tell you what's happening at the bargaining table.
Une question en français. Ce sous-financement que vous décrivez, concrètement, c'est quoi les impacts pour les conseils scolaires, pour les écoles? Est-ce qu'on parle de réduire des services aux élèves?
Ce seront des impacts permanents parce que quand on ne fait pas attention, par exemple, à ta voiture, éventuellement, il faut acheter une nouvelle voiture. Nous ne voulons pas acheter un nouvel système d'éducation. Nous voulons améliorer notre système maintenant, avoir des investissements maintenant et assurer les parents, les familles de l'Ontario qu'on va investir dans l'avenir de la province.
Pour revenir sur les négociations, est-ce que c'est un point que vous soulevez? C'est quoi l'impact sur les négociations en cours?
Oui. Quand on a un gouvernement qui continue d'introduire de régulations, de législation pendant que nous sommes aux tables de négociation sans nous parler de ces régulations, c'est vraiment un problème. C'est un autre indice qu'ils ne veulent pas parler à nous ni collaborer avec nous.
Sorry, Karen, what did you say the school repair backlog was up to now?
Well, so it's hard to collect that data. We work with a group called Fix Our Schools, and from their latest numbers, it's about $16.8 billion. But, boards also don't have, it's funny, the government wants to talk about the priorities and have that on a public website, but they don't want to talk about the needs in the schools as far as repairs and what's needed. I have grave concerns not about a mandatory tech program, but the fact that over the years, the schools have not been financed in order to have up-to-date tech shops. Millions of dollars are needed to go into a repair. I'm just thinking of my own school alone, and you took one department and did a repair, and it was several $1 million, and it took a couple of years. It's great if we're going to have mandatory courses. Who's going to teach them, and are the classrooms going to be able to deliver what the students need to?
I know you gave us some initial thoughts the day they introduced this new legislation, but have you had a bit more time with it to look through it? Do you have any sort of deeper understanding of it now, or any other concerns that you wanted to flag?
Like with wine and scotch, they get better with age. This one hasn't gotten any better. There's really nothing that's better in it that we're looking at. It's very challenging, and as you look more and as you read more commentary about it, we're talking about the fact that there is more red tape. It seems to me, from my perspective, a distrust of the elected trustees in the system and the need to regulate them more as opposed to investing in the students and looking at what's needed. There's very little that was introduced on the weekend that will actually have an impact that a student or a parent would say, this is really helpful. This is more about, making the school board's real estate, being able to sell off the real estate. That's what I viewed it as a real estate announcement as opposed to an education announcement.
I know you answered this in French, but maybe we can do it in English as well.
Yeah.
A little bit of a flip there. But what is the trickle-down effect of not getting the funding that you're looking for?
Yeah. And we've got a couple of other things, and I've heard the government say COVID had an impact and all of those kind of things. We've got to be able to recover from that. But the long-term impact of not investing in education is that the system falls apart. Right now, we have 40,000 qualified teachers in Ontario who are choosing to not work in education. And I would say that's directly related to the working conditions and the changes that have been made by the Ford government over the years. We look at the supports that are needed. I was working with a PSSP group, so a group of psychologists, child and work. Yesterday, I was at a meeting with them. They said, we don't even know when we go into school if we're going to have a space. We're working in a stairwell, and we come in and somebody takes the space that we have. So how are they able to provide the supports to those students when the buildings aren't sufficient for what they need in order to have the space, but we also don't have enough of them? They said to me quite clearly, I'm doing the job of 4 other members of my bargaining unit because the people aren't there and they're not able to deal with that type of workload. So it's incredibly challenging for them. So the long-term impact, we can talk about jobs and we can talk about schools, is to the students of the province. If you're not investing in the students of the province, if you're not saying to them it's a priority, then we're not getting what we need. I think back to Minister Bethlen Falvey and his presentation of the budget and the lovely road trip through the GTHA all the way to Windsor and the factories and everything. Where's the story being told about the student who comes to school in junior kindergarten and has the supports that they need? There's an early childhood educator, and as they go through the primary grades, the classes aren't overloaded and they're not out in portables. And as they go through the junior years, if they have some needs that they're being identified, and school supports are there for them. And when they go to high school, they have the supports, and if they want to go on to post-secondary, that they're able to do that as well. None of that is part of the story. The story is about the highways and the factories and the developers.
You said 40,000 teachers certified.
There's 40,000 teachers with Ontario College of Teachers certification who are not working in education. That's a massive number. And right now we have people who have a high school diploma who are covering in classes because there aren't enough teachers to be in the building. Education Act says you have to have a teacher. There's a clause in the Education Act that allows a board to say, if we can't find anybody, somebody with a high school diploma is enough. How is that okay? It comes from the College of Teachers through the Ontario Teachers Federation.
So typically what would those people do if they're not working in the education system?
Well, they're probably working maybe in the private sector or somewhere else, or like they're not working as teachers in the public education system right now in Ontario. I don't know if my colleagues here have. Are you my colleagues? I'm not an MPP. You're my colleagues. So.
We're colleagues.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Karen. Karen's raised incredibly important points this morning, and I think what they really speak to is the extent to which this week the bill and the announcement on Monday has been a communications exercise by the minister to detract from his own responsibility for shortchanging children in Ontario's public education system. He's talked so much about transparency and accountability in the legislature, and yet what we see from him time and time again, as we have with the Grants for Student Needs this week, is a minister who likes to play games with statistics and numbers. He did it repeatedly during the CUPE negotiations on what CUPE members were actually asking for. Very memorably, how many days of strikes have disrupted Ontario education in the past 20 years. And we're seeing it again with the Grants for Student Needs this week, and at the same time, he's asking school boards to publicly report data. We have been unable to get the government to report what the school repair backlog actually is. And it's not for lack of trying, because I asked him in committee, I asked him via a letter, I've asked him via the order paper. We filed a Freedom of Information request that was denied. A government that actually wanted transparency and accountability for what is happening in the education system would reveal the information and would be forthcoming about what is happening. And so what we need is for the minister to stop playing games and actually invest in our children in Ontario.
What grounds was that FOI denied on?
The economic interests of the province. Yeah, if you have an idea how knowing what the repair backlog is harms the economic interests of the province, I would love to hear it because I can't figure out what it would be. I would think knowing that we have these opportunities for construction jobs to do repairs in our school would be a good thing for the economic interests of our province.
So I'll just echo what Chandra had to say is this government always oversells what it's doing in education, and it's creating expectations that classrooms are going to be unable to meet. 2.7, 1.8, whatever you calculate the GSNs at, it's still below inflation, and it's not enough. 1,000 new teachers is 1 for every 5 schools. We have 2,000 less teachers than we did in 2018. And here's the thing. If there's a problem in education, it's probably the same as the problem we have everywhere else, in healthcare, in construction. It's people. We don't have enough people to help our children in school. Not a word about retention. Not one single word about retaining teachers. It's not about recruitment and retention, it's about retention and recruitment. So this government's not serious about education. You have a minister who I'd love if I was selling cereal or a new product. He does a great job. Problem is, there's not a lot in the box. The real problem is, that's shortchanging our kids. They're not serious about education. It's something that they have to do while they're doing something else. And I'll let Mike say a few words.
Well, I think Karen's numbers today just highlighted exactly what I said on Monday. We have a government that's prioritizing selling schools over investing in students. And the chronic problem we see in all of our public services, but I would say especially in healthcare and education, is a failure to invest in the people who care for our kids, teach our kids, care for our loved ones in healthcare. That's why you see nurses leaving the profession. That's why you have 40,000 certified teachers not teaching, because we have a government that is failing to invest in students and the people who care for those students.
Chandra, est-ce que vous pouvez juste revenir sur votre point sur la transparence en français?
Oui. Merci et désolé que je n'ai pas fait auparavant, mais ce que nous avons vu du ministre cette semaine, c'est un grand exercice dans les relations publiques. Il a beaucoup parlé de la transparence et accountability, et la responsabilité pour les actions des conseils scolaires. Mais ce que nous avons vu du ministre, c'est qu'il ne prend pas la responsabilité pour ses propres actions et il ne montre pas la transparence. Il fait des jeux toujours avec les statistiques sur le montant de financement pour les écoles, sur les demandes des travailleurs du SCFP, sur le nombre de jours qui ont été perdus pour une grève dans la province de l'Ontario. Et ce que nous voyons aussi, c'est que son gouvernement manque de la transparence. J'ai demandé le montant pour les réparations faites aux bâtiments dans la province et il a refusé pendant plusieurs années de donner ce numéro. Donc, ce dont nous avons besoin, c'est de la transparence et la responsabilité du ministre.
I'm just going to throw one more thing in because I forgot to say this. There's one question about this piece of legislation, and Mike referred to it, and that's the new powers the government's giving itself about the disposal of school property. And no one has been able to answer this question on the government side. With these new powers, does the government return the value of that asset once it's sold it to the people who paid for it in those communities? So are they going to grab that asset, that school? Are they going to sell that school? And is that going to go into provincial government coffers and just spread out? Or is it going to go to education in Ottawa, in Windsor, in Oshawa, in Toronto, as to invest in what needs to be done in schools? And the government has not answered that question. I've asked them. If I can be so bold, please ask them. Thank you.
Thank you.